It is Thanksgiving week, and of course this week I will be eating plenty of turkey and stuffing, but I'm also going to be fighting for playoff seeding in my particular leagues, and I know that you're doing the exact same thing. So our top 30 rankings at the wide receiver position, they need to be set in stone for week 13 fantasy football. And I'm giving away 5 free FN hats for when I hit 19,000 subscribers, and the way to qualify to get one is to go down there, drop a like on the video, subscribe to the channel, and give me your hottest take for week 13. So getting into our first tier right here, I've got Nico Collins at number 1 and Jamar Chase at number 2. Now with these guys, obviously with Nico Collins, the matchup is fantastic. Nico Collins for the second straight week got a touchdown called back. That is ridiculous, and Nico Collins was a great fantasy player in his second week back. So Nico Collins here, if he stops getting touchdowns called back, he's going to go nuclear, and it's going to happen at some point. In this matchup versus Jacksonville, where they cannot stop a nosebleed, yeah, I'm taking Nico Collins at number 1, and Jamar Chase at number 2 just has a little bit of a tougher matchup versus Pittsburgh. Now, a lot of people will say, well, why don't you just go ahead and rank A.J. Brown over him, because he's got the Baltimore Ravens, who are dead last versus wide receivers. Listen, the reason I'm not doing that is because with Jamar Chase, this team doesn't have the threat of the run as good as the Eagles do with Saquon Barkley. Chase Brown's been fine, but he's not Saquon Barkley and the threat that he possesses on the ground. So that means that there will be less balance to the Bengals, and that's what you want from a wide receiver, because it's Jamar Chase, it's T. Higgins, and it's Joe Burrow. That's this offense right here. So out of necessity, I've got him over A.J. Brown, but A.J. Brown is inside of this tier because he will also be a fantastic play versus the Ravens defense this week. Dropping down to our next tier, Amon-Ra St. Brown at number 4. Listen, it's a Thanksgiving game. Detroit takes these Thanksgiving games very, very seriously. So when I see him matching up against Chicago's defense, obviously I don't like that matchup. They have been historically tough versus wide receivers all year long in fantasy football. But when it comes down to it, as long as he's out there, and it's going to be one to watch throughout the rest of the week because he was limited as a non-participant in practice on the estimated injury report on Monday. But if he's out there, I'm still playing him because I can just see, I can picture it. Amon-Ra St. Brown in the end zone doing a touchdown dance on Thanksgiving Day. And then we've got our 2 Rams wide receivers here, Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp. These guys are basically conjoined twins at this point. They are attached at the hip, and then they just kind of branch out like those conjoined twins. These 2 guys right here have been awesome in fantasy. And again, they can't split up because they're still getting basically the same amount of work. Now again, the one thing I will say is I believe Puka actually has the higher ceiling. Now Cooper Kupp has been performing better in fantasy for the majority of the time because he's getting the higher percentage throws. The throws close to the line of scrimmage, the throws at the red zone. He's getting those throws while Puka is getting a lot more downfield targets. So against the matchup versus New Orleans, where that's not nearly as tough as they had just last week versus the Philadelphia Eagles, I prefer Puka slightly, but again, you can move these 2 either way you want because they're conjoined twins. And then with Justin Jefferson here at number 7, I think that his matchup versus Arizona is good. Seattle just carved them up through the air. And with Justin Jefferson, it is also important to note this. The Justin Jefferson saga has not been good the last month. He has had bad games. It has not been Justin Jefferson-esque. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that Sam Darnold is just simply not getting it done enough as we need from his, for providing fantasy upside to his wide receiver 1. Now, I think that can change in an instant because Justin Jefferson is an elite football player. So I don't really overthink this one too terribly much, to be honest with you. Yes, I get it. We are in crunch time. You need to make good decisions. But at the same time, if Justin Jefferson ends up going off on your bench, or if I rank him too much lower, you're going to be like, why did you do that? Because he's an elite player. I'm not doing that this week. Dropping down to our next tier, Terry McLaurin at 8 and Drake London at 9. With Terry McLaurin versus the Tennessee Titans, he goes off last week against the Dallas Cowboys. Now, the Tennessee Titans are actually a much better defense versus wide receivers than the Dallas Cowboys are. They're actually really good, ironically, versus wide receivers. But Terry McLaurin last week, the majority of his production came on one big play. But it's just that, he's always capable of the big play, number 1. And number 2, the chemistry that he's built with Jayden Daniels over this year is so good. So against the Tennessee Titans, where I fully expect them to win this game, I want Terry McLaurin just as much I want Drake London, because Drake London versus the Chargers just got carved up by the Ravens, mostly on the ground, but still through the air as well with Rashad Bateman's big play. Drake London has had some down moments over the last month specifically, and there's been more consistency with his down moments because I think this offense is starting to fail. So coming out of the bye week, I still think they can get things right, but the fact of the matter is Terry has been more consistent than Drake London all year, so I slightly prefer him over Drake London this week. Jackson Smith-Njigba and DK Metcalf are two Seahawks wide receivers at the New York Jets this week. You know, I just think that anybody can beat the Jets. Like, the two New York teams right now are the most disgraceful, dysfunctional organizations in America. They're horrible. Like, they're absolutely tragic in the NFL right now. It's an embarrassment. And so I just think that anybody who takes them on is going to have a good day. And Jackson Smith-Njigba has been playing really well over the last month, and DK is just right there. It's very similar to Justin Jefferson. This guy is getting opportunities. It just hasn't hit on a big play yet. I still do think that the potential to do that is just, it can happen at any moment. The snap of a finger, it can happen. So I'm still going to have him ranked right here with Jackson Smith-Njigba because JSN has become the target guy in this offense, while DK Metcalf is sort of kind of becoming a Mike Evans type to where he doesn't have as many targets per game as Chris Godwin, aka Jackson Smith-Njigba, but at the same time, he has the bigger play upside. So when he hits that week, he's going to be a better fantasy play than Jackson Smith-Njigba. I like them both this week. That's why they're both inside the top 12. I also love Patrick Mahomes' projection on underdog this week because in the Black Friday game versus the Raiders, his projection is 0.5 total yards. New customers, you're winning free money when you hit the higher on this one. So if you want to take advantage of this one, go down in the comments and grab the link that's there and use code FFN to sign up for underdog. When you hit the higher on the sweat-free pick with Patrick Mahomes this week, they will match your first deposit 50% up to $1,000 in bonus cash. Now, dropping down to our next tier, Jawan Jennings at 12 and Courtland Sutton at 13. With Jawan Jennings, don't forget about him. Don't forget about him. Brock Purdy, it obviously comes down to does Brock Purdy play or not? I did read a report that Kyle Shanahan was kind of encouraged with how he was feeling after the game on Sunday, so I like his chances of returning on Sunday night versus the Buffalo Bills. Now, Jawan Jennings, again, it all comes down to it, but at the same time, what one thing was proven is that he is the wide receiver one, with or without Brock Purdy. He is the best wide receiver route runner in this offense right now, so he clearly is the number one guy that you want, not Deebo Samuel. Jawan Jennings, the moment Brock comes back, has a 20 to 25 point ceiling. And then with Courtland Sutton versus the Cleveland Browns, the matchup is good on Monday Night Football, and just the way that him and Bo have been playing is lights out. They're on a heater right now. And it's not only that, it's also because Courtland Sutton is so clearly this number one wide receiver. He's averaging basically like 9 targets per game over the last month and a half. Like, he has been so involved in this offense on a weekly basis, and the way Cleveland played against the Pittsburgh Steelers could indicate that they're going to be a more competitive outing this week on a Monday Night Football game. Now, dropping down to 14 and 15, Mike Evans and CeeDee Lamb here. With Mike Evans at Carolina, I said this afterwards in my playoff wide receiver rankings video. People will look at this and say, oh, Mike Evans isn't the same guy. It's like, no, like Mike Evans is still top dog in Tampa, and Baker has been playing out of his mind for the majority of the year. It was Mike Evans' first game in like a month. Give him a break. Like, the dude's in his 30s. So just give him some time. Against Carolina, who again, ironically has been good versus wide receivers. That's not because they're a good defense. That's because you can run all over the Carolina Panthers. Well, Mahomes just proved that you can carve them up through the air too. Now, obviously, Mahomes is Mahomes. Baker's not Mahomes, but I still love Mike Evans heading into this week as well because I think that he can absolutely have a big game against anybody, but especially against a divisional opponent with the Carolina Panthers. And then with CeeDee Lamb here, on Thursday, obviously, it's going to be the worst Thanksgiving game. Like, I will probably be either taking a nap or barely watching this game while drinking some wine. Like, that's like honestly my reality because this game is going to be so gross to watch, but I have to watch it. I will have to watch it because this is what I do. But this game I couldn't have less interest in. CeeDee Lamb, though, one of the only storylines I'm interested in is can CeeDee Lamb have a ceiling game? Because this week versus the Giants, it doesn't get much better. Now, he was limited estimate participant in practice today, so I guess keep an eye on that. Monday, he was limited, but with CeeDee Lamb, he's probably going to end up playing, and if he does play, I ultimately just kind of want to see, can he hit a ceiling game? Because right now his floor is stable. I do think that his floor is definitely around 10 to 12 points, but I want to see if he can hit a 20-point ceiling game against a reeling New York Giants. Dropping down to our next tier. T. Higgins at 16 and Zay Flowers at 17. So with T. Higgins here versus Pittsburgh, I know that I'm probably too high on the Bengals right now because I do think like their offense, it's so crazy how they're losing so many games because their offense, the way that T. Higgins, Joe Burrow, and Jamar Chase are playing is lights out. T. Higgins is averaging like 15 fantasy points per game because they don't have so much of a threat on the ground. Again, Chase Brown's a good fantasy back. A lot of it's because he's getting pass catching opportunities. It's not because he's a world beater on the ground. So they have to use T. Higgins a lot. And I think that this matchup with Joey Porter Jr. probably going to be shadowing Jamar Chase, who has been really underrated this year, by the way. Joey Porter Jr., that is. I think T. Higgins is definitely going to be open for more opportunities. I think he has still the big ceiling in this game. Zay Flowers versus Philadelphia. Don't love the matchup. There's no secret about it. And really what it comes down to is it's not even a matchup thing for me. Zay Flowers just ultimately has a low floor and a high ceiling. Sort of like a Marvin Harris Jr. type, except I believe that Zay can hit it more often than Marvin because that's all I've seen this year. Marvin is definitely not as volatile, while Zay is a guy that absolutely can get it more consistently. So I've got him here at 17 against the Philadelphia Eagles, who I don't love the matchup, but I always do like the potential. And then with Garrett Wilson at 18 and then Darnell Mooney at 19, Garrett Wilson is going downhill for sure. This is a failing team. It's a sinking ship offense. Aaron Rodgers might be benched here soon. This team culture is so bad right now, and that will leak into fantasy football production. It's already been happening the past 2 weeks. Like, Garrett Wilson has gone downhill in fantasy football. Versus Seattle, the matchup's totally beatable, but ultimately what it comes down to also is with an aggressive pass rush like Seattle does occasionally have, this Jets offensive line is horrible, so how much can they really protect Rodgers to get the ball deep to Garrett Wilson? You know what I'm saying? Like, a lot of those shorter routes do go to Devonta Adams. So I think that's a factor in why Garrett Wilson hasn't been producing as much, and I worry about it this week. With Darnell Mooney, obviously he's questionable coming out of the bye week because he got a hamstring injury the last time they played and got the crap kicked out of him by Denver. Now with Darnell Mooney here, the reality is that if this offense wasn't experiencing issues, he'd actually be probably at the top of this tier with T. Higgins. But Darnell Mooney definitely has suffered in conjunction with this entire offense, because their offense has definitely looked worse over the last some weeks than they did kind of the beginning of the year. So with Darnell Mooney, I've got the fear of that a little bit still, but ultimately if this offense comes out of the bye looking to punch someone in the mouth, Darnell Mooney could absolutely have a 20-point ceiling in this game versus the Chargers, who just got sliced up. DJ Moore at 20. I'm back in. Like, I wouldn't say I'm back in. This is a short week, Thursday game versus Detroit on Thanksgiving. In Detroit, they're going to play really hard, and Detroit is really smothering teams defensively. So I don't love this matchup by any stretch of the imagination. But I have said this for weeks now. Shane Waldron is awful as an offensive coordinator. Awful. There's a chart out there that shows DJ Moore's route tree with and without Shane Waldron, and I gotta tell you, it is one of the saddest things I've ever seen in my entire life. Jackson Smith-Njigba was right about Shane Waldron, guys. I think that DJ Moore here has so much more potential, and it showed the past 2 weeks. He had a ceiling game that he just hit against the Minnesota Vikings. I just don't love this matchup because Detroit is smothering teams. So yes, I'm definitely back in and willing to play DJ Moore, but this week is not particularly my favorite matchup. Dropping down to our next tier, Ladd McConkey at 21 and George Pickens at 22. With Ladd McConkey, I said this last night of what I got right and wrong. There is simply no question, like, who the number one wide receiver is in Los Angeles, and Herbert tries to get the ball to Quentin Johnson and Josh Palmer. Those guys stink. Ladd McConkey is the only one that's worth anything. He's the only one worth his jock in that Los Angeles Chargers room. Atlanta is so beatable through the air. I love the matchup. I love the Ravens matchup, and Ladd was okay because he's still dealing with an injury for sure. So I think that Ladd McConkey here is ultimately kind of hampered by injury a little bit. That's the only thing keeping him down here at this point. George Pickens at Cincinnati this week at 22. His ceiling is pretty decent, and his floor is still relatively low. Like, floor is like a 7 to 8.4 in half PPR format, while the ceiling is like in the 20s. So George Pickens, it kind of just depends on matchup. Matchup is good, but ultimately with Russell, there has been some shortcomings over the last several weeks, and those were both in divisional games. This is another divisional game. Cincinnati knows how to play the Steelers, so ultimately with their bad defense, I kind of give them a leg up like I did with the Browns last week. So Pickens here, I just for Lad over someone like George Pickens this week, who's still the wide receiver one clearly in Pittsburgh, but is more reliant on big plays. And then we've got Jayden Reed at 23 and Tyreek Hill at 24. Jayden Reed, maybe I'm still too high on him, honestly. Like, you ever seen that clip of Cat Williams, that one comedy special he had back in the day where he was like talking about seeing tigers at the museum, and he was like, am I really a tiger? Like, that's how I feel about Jayden Reed. I know the guy can go off, but it's been so long. Now I'm questioning whether he can go off or not. Like, I want to see it so bad versus Miami on Thanksgiving Day. I want to see it, but it has not been there. And the irony is, like, he's been involved. Like, the first quarter, you think like, oh, he came out with 3 catches in the first drive. He's going to have a big game. And then you don't see him again. It's like bizarre. So he still can do it. I believe it. But it definitely, like, I might still be too high on him this week, but I feel like this is pretty low. And then Tyreek Hill at Green Bay in the same matchup. Tyreek Hill is already questionable in this game. Listen, this injury is so affecting him. If you don't see it, I don't know what to tell you. There's a reason he hasn't had 100-yard performance but in week 1 this year. You take out week 1, there's no 100-yard performances. He's got 3 receiving touchdowns this year. Tyreek Hill is totally affected by this injury. And you know what it does? It affects his ceiling. Completely. So Tyreek Hill, even against Green Bay, even if Jair Alexander doesn't play, I still don't love Tyreek Hill. I like Jaylen Waddle these days, probably as much as I like Tyreek Hill. Now, Jaylen Waddle, you may or may not see him at the end of these rankings, but Tyreek Hill, I'm definitely lower on him right now. And then dropping down to our last tier, Calvin Ridley at 25, Devonta Smith at 26. With Calvin Ridley, it's actually becoming more and more stable. And I'm tempted to kind of rank him over Tyreek Hill at some point. Should I not? I don't know. Let me know in the comments, because Washington, the matchup's great. Obviously, they're very beatable defensively. They're actually going downhill as a team as well. And Will Levis actually looked pretty functional. Like, I didn't think I'd say it, but he looked functional last week against the Houston Texans, a much better defense than the Washington Commanders. So, Calvin Ridley remains a high ceiling play. It's still a relatively lower floor play, but it's getting better on a weekly basis, and I might start to rank him a lot higher than this. Devonta Smith obviously missed the game on Sunday night versus the Los Angeles Rams. At Baltimore, if he plays, I do want a piece of him, but ultimately, it still does, 2 things still bother me. Number 1, the injury, and number 2, because of the fact that Devonta Smith has been so hit or miss this year, there is still always the potential that he just does nothing. And the way A.J. Brown was firing on all cylinders on Sunday night versus the Los Angeles Rams, maybe A.J.'s just getting on his heater right now, and Devonta takes the back seat. Either way, I've got my issues with Devonta Smith right now. Jakobi Meyers at 27, and yes, Marvin lands at 28. With Jakobi Meyers here at Kansas City, the irony with Jakobi Meyers is that I hated his matchup last week against Denver, and he carved them to pieces. He ripped them up. And Pat Surtain, I watched a little bit of that game, and I still haven't watched the full thing. I'm going to have to go back and watch it. But when I watched it, Pat Surtain was not following him around. So with Jakobi Meyers, again, I don't like this match versus Kansas City, but it's a Black Friday game. Raiders always take the game seriously. Jakobi Meyers at this point is a very solid wide receiver 3 play. And then with Marvin Harris Jr. at 28 at Minnesota, I think that with Marvin Harris Jr., it just, like, if you are still in denial about Marvin Harrison and, like, why are you ranking him so low? It's like, dude, look at his game log. Like, we have enough evidence at this point to say that Marvin Harrison Jr. is not a wide receiver 2 in fantasy. He's just not. Like, in a year where there's been tons of wide receiver injuries and tons of inconsistencies, well, he's like not even a top 24 wide receiver right now. It's embarrassing, actually. So Marvin Harris Jr. at Minnesota. Yeah, the matchup's beatable. You know what? Until he starts doing it consistently, he's going to find himself basically around top 25, top 30 for me. And then Malik Neighbors at 29 and Jaylen Waddle at 30 to round it out. Malik Neighbors here, the Giants quit the other game. Like, they quit against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And Malik Neighbors said after the fact that their problem is not the quarterback. Like, there's deep issues way down in this organization right now with the Giants. And I don't know if it gets solved this week. Like, Malik Neighbors obviously is a great play, but ultimately the reason he was not inside my top 30 fantasy wide receiver rankings for the playoffs is because of this issue. He's got Tommy Cutlets at quarterback when they could be going with Drew Lock. There's a deeper organizational problem here that's way down in the fiber of this team, and I don't know how you get rid of it. So even though they play the Dallas Cowboys on Thanksgiving and it's a beatable matchup, I just don't have tons of confidence in Malik Neighbors the way he's been playing in fantasy. And then with Jaylen Waddle here, I would love to rank him higher, but the reality is we've had too big of a sample size this year to rank him much higher than this. He's been bad the majority of the year. He had a big explosion game, and I was happy to see it as a Jaylen Waddle owner in a lot of best ball leagues. But the reality with Jaylen Waddle is it's not been good enough, and until he does it again, he's not going to see himself much higher than the top 30, and I like his opportunity this week against the Green Bay Packers on Thanksgiving night. So let me know how your team is looking this week, and if you want to see the top 30 wide receivers for the fantasy playoffs, click on this video right here.